NBA free agency has begun, and as of recording this, we are nearing the end of day one of free agency. And so far, the Sacramento Kings haven't done anything. Well, kind of haven't done anything. There have been quite a few rumors, and there was one report from Fred Katz that the Kings had signed Dennis Schroder. But then there were no details about that. Every other deal, we have the details, except for the Dennis Schroder deal. So that's interesting. But there have been lots of rumors, and it's been a fairly busy day in the NBA. But so far, the big talking points when it comes to the Sacramento Kings and the big rumors or things that have happened. First of all is Dennis Schroder. It sure seems like Dennis Schroder is going to be a Sacramento King on a deal that is probably around $28 million over 2 years because the mid-level exception is $14.1 million. So he'll just be a mid-level exception, a full MLE type of player for the Kings. And then the Kings are also looking for a backup point guard to go alongside Dennis Schroder as the starting point guard. And the big rumor has been Russell Westbrook. The Kings have met with Westbrook right when free agency started at 3 o'clock. There were like no moves because the NBA cracked down on tampering, or at least, kind of cracked down on tampering. Everyone's still having conversations before free agency starts, but the news doesn't start coming out until a little bit later. So the big news was the Kings are meeting with Schroder, Westbrook, and Brogdon on Zoom, specifically Zoom, which was an interesting detail. Not sure we needed that, but I appreciate it. So the Kings were specifically going after Schroder and Westbrook, and both of them at the same time, which is interesting. Not just one point guard, they want a backup point guard as well, because there are 0 point guards on the Kings' current roster. So I guess it could make sense that you want both a starter and a backup. But then the other guys that have been rumored, like I said, Malcolm Brogdon, Chris Paul, there was like a little bit of a rumor at one point, although I haven't seen anything about Chris Paul lately to the Kings. But very obviously the Kings going after these veteran point guards. The other big piece of Kings news is not a good one. Jake LaRavia signed with the Lakers for $12 million over 2 years. And so if you recall, the Kings were limited to offer LaRavia about $5.1 million. And so the Lakers just upped that by $700K, I believe it was, and were able to steal Jake LaRavia from us. And that is extremely disappointing. I mean, that's a very big blow because the Kings already very weak in terms of wing depth. And if you watch and listen to me a lot, you know how big of a Jake LaRavia fan I was ever since he got here last season. It's not like the Kings gave up a whole lot to get Jake LaRavia. It was Alex Len, Colby Jones, and a second-round pick. And so it was definitely worth the risk. And Jake LaRavia was honestly too good for the Kings late last season. But LaRavia, he was just such a breath of fresh air as finally another wing to go alongside Keegan Murray. And I was thinking that maybe he could be someone that even could start on this Kings team next season if he was still here, starting at the 4 alongside Keegan Murray and taking some of the bigger defensive assignments so that Keegan didn't always have to, and that would have been really nice. LaRavia is such a good player because he's a dog defensively, a 40+% three-point shooter. I mean, it's really annoying that the Lakers got him because Dorian Finney-Smith left to the Rockets, so they replaced him with Jake LaRavia on a very good deal. So, I mean, that's a very good deal for the Lakers and super disappointing for the Kings. And it's just going to be super hard for them to replace LaRavia. And so Nick Clifford, the Kings rookie, is going to have to play a role for the Kings this upcoming season because it's going to be really hard to replace LaRavia on the wing. But Nick Clifford does not have the size of Jake LaRavia. He's 6'5". LaRavia was 6'8". Nick Clifford is very much more of a 2-3 than a 3-4. And Jake LaRavia is 23 years old, so it's super disappointing to lose him, especially to the Lakers. But I did know coming in that it was a pretty big possibility that we could lose him. So now let's go to the Dennis Schroder news, which has been the talk of the town in Sacramento, if you will. Because I think the addition of Dennis Schroder is a very controversial one for Kings fans. because Dennis Schroder is 31 years old. He's a veteran. He's not going to contribute to any sort of youth movement for the Kings, but he also is not a star level point guard, right? He is a backup for many teams. He has played the backup role a lot of his career. He's been close to winning Sixth Man of the Year at times, coming, I believe, second with OKC in, what was that, 2019, 2020, when OKC was doing the whole Shea with Chris Paul and Dennis Schroder 3-guard thing. But the question really is, should the Kings be looking to add this veteran type of point guard when he's not going to push you over the edge of contending in the Western Conference? And when I say contending, I mean even for like a playoff spot. Like, what is the ceiling for a team when you're adding Dennis Schroder as the starting point guard for this Kings team? Now, I think Dennis Schroder is a very good player, and I think a team that is starting Dennis Schroder can be very good. Can this Kings team, as currently constructed, if you add Dennis Schroder, be very good? No, I don't think so. And so, I mean, again, it's not official that Dennis Schroder is a King, but if we just assume he is, like, I'm just going to be assuming that Dennis Schroder is a Sacramento King here. The Kings still need to make plenty more moves, but the problem is it's just going to be very hard to make those moves in order to contend. And so that begs the question, kind of just, well, then what's the point of bringing in a veteran like Dennis Schroder if he's going to take minutes away from your young guards like a Devin Carter or a Keon Ellis? He's going to take shots away from maybe a Keegan Murray even. And also, you didn't sign Keon Ellis long term because you wanted to maintain flexibility money-wise this season to be able to sign a guy like Dennis Schroder. And so, me included, many Kings fans want the Kings to be able to pick a direction, and it feels like signing Dennis Schroder isn't necessarily picking direction. But the thing that I will say to that is the situation that Scott Perry has inherited here is not a good one, and it's not a good one to the extent that it's difficult to even pick a direction, because there's really no way to be able to compete with this current roster, but there also isn't really a way to rebuild. And so while I would love if the Kings would commit to a rebuild, and if they would just commit to giving young guys opportunities, and to not have a guy like Dennis Schroder, and just to go full youth movement, the reality of the situation is the Kings can't do that. I would love for the Kings to be able to get a high draft pick in 2026, and they still might be able to, just because of the Western Conference is so strong. But the problem comes down to the contracts that the Kings have, mainly in Zach LaVine and Domantas Sabonis, where you're stuck with these guys. Even DeMar DeRozan, maybe even a guy like Malik Monk, where you have these contracts and you're stuck with them. And so you're stuck in a position where you can't rebuild because you can't get off of these contracts. The only way you can get off of these contracts is if you attach assets to them. Not necessarily the Malik Monk one, but the LaVine one and the Sabonis one. You would have to attach assets to get off of those deals. And so that's not something the Kings should do. And so when I was talking, previewing this upcoming free agency, I said that it was probably going to be a transition year for the Kings, and that Scott Perry had to try to work his magic. And that is truly what Scott Perry has to do. He has to work his magic by somehow offloading some of these contracts. But the reality is that's probably not going to happen. And so this year for the Kings, they probably aren't going to be really contending for the playoffs. I would say the ceiling of this team is contending for the play-in, and then you never know what could happen, and they could make the playoffs. But they're also not going to be at the bottom of the Western Conference contending for the top pick, most likely. And it sucks that it has to be this year because 2026 draft class is absolutely loaded. So I would love if the Kings could get a top pick, but that's just not the reality of the situation. And the reality of the situation is that we're probably just not going to be happy with this upcoming season. We're probably in a situation where we have to write out this season, and next offseason, LaVine will be an expiring deal. Sabonis will have one less deal on his contract. DeMar will be on a partial guarantee, right? These guys will be easier to move And so it's going to feel like a wasted season, and it's a transition season, but that's kind of where we're at. And so you bring in a guy like Dennis Schroder really to try to be as good as possible in a season where you can't rebuild. Because if the team is good, you need a point guard, right? You need a point guard to be able to help the other guys on your roster. Zach LaVine needs a point guard to be effective. Domantas Sabonis needs another ball handler that he can play with. Everyone benefits from having a point guard on the roster. And so the hope is that a guy like Dennis Schroder can come in and can help this team be okay and can help really the trade value of the players on this team so that you can trade them at the trade deadline or after the season. I mean, that's the position that the Kings are in. And so from that perspective, I do think Dennis Schroder is a solid signing. The Kings need a point guard. They get a guy who throughout his career has just been very solid. On his career, averaging 14 points per game, 5 assists per game. Last season, he played for 3 different teams, started with Brooklyn and was the starting point guard there. Averaged 18.5 points per game and 6.5 assists. Shot well from 3 while he was there, almost 39%. Then he went to Golden State. It didn't really work out there. Went to Detroit, was solid there. But on the season total, he averaged 13 points per game. He averaged 5.5 assists per game. He was at 34% from 3. He's also a solid defender. I also like the personality that he brings to this team, where he's not afraid to get into it with guys. And he's probably not afraid to get into it with his teammates if he needs to as well. And that's someone that the Kings could use. We don't want Mr. Nice Guy in the locker room anymore. Like, I don't anyways. And so bringing in a personality like Dennis Schroder could be nice. I mean, same can be said for Russell Westbrook if the Kings are able to bring in Russell Westbrook. And I think that's part of what Scott Perry is trying to do here. Is all offseason, he's talked about identity. And that's what he's trying to bring in. Dennis Schroder is a very solid defender. He's going to get after it, and he's going to bring that personality. Russell Westbrook is a guy who, wherever he's gone, his teammates have loved him. And he's a guy who plays with a bunch of energy, hustles, and is also going to bring that personality. And so, does it make sense to bring in Dennis Schroder and Russell Westbrook and just clog our guard rotation even more? I don't know if it really makes sense. And it sure feels like Malik Monk is definitely the odd man out at that point, which it already felt like that anyways. And so, especially if you bring in 2 point guards, then he definitely is. But in a season where you weren't going to compete and you weren't going to rebuild, so you might as well just bring in these guys who are going to hopefully allow you to establish an identity and hopefully allow you to play better basketball than you would have before and make everyone on the team look better. Dennis Schroder is a guy who is a very solid passer. He can get into the pick and roll. He can play make there. He's a crafty finisher around the rim. He has an off the dribble jumper game. He can push the pace. He can play fast. I mean, I'm a big fan of Dennis Schroder as a player, and I think he's worth the full mid-level exception. And so if he's getting the full mid-level exception over 2 seasons, I also think that's a contract that you can probably easily move. There's always going to be a team out there that's looking for a backup guard when they're making a playoff push, just like Detroit was last season or Golden State was last season. Both teams traded for him. So you're probably going to be able to trade him if you need to. And so for me, as long as Scott Perry coming into this offseason isn't making things worse, he isn't adding more bad contracts, he isn't committing to big contracts long term, if he's just bringing in a veteran point guard for 2 years or a year, then I don't see anything wrong with that. The only thing that might be wrong with that is if you lose Keon Ellis because of it, because you didn't lock up Keon Ellis long term. That's the one problem that I could have with this. It's tough to see the vision. I mean, you really can't see the vision right now, but you can't see the vision because of the mistake that the previous front office made, which was the De'Aaron Fox trade for Zach LaVine. That's the mistake that is not allowing this team to pick a direction right now. And so you just have to wait that out. And that sucks. And that's not what people want to hear. but it's probably just the reality of the situation. But now let's get into, well, why isn't the Dennis Schroder move official? And now technically nothing becomes official until I believe it's July 6th. But why don't we have the details of this Dennis Schroder move? That's very odd when every other deal we have the details of. And so there's a lot of speculation. Could there be a sign and trade in the works? Jake Fisher has reported that Malik Monk is an option for the Pistons in a sign and trade. Now, one sign and trade move that has been brought up just on social media, no actual reports of this, but one, thing that people have just made up is Malik Monk and DeMar DeRozan to the Pistons for Dennis Schroder and Tobias Harris. That's a move I can get down with just because Dennis Schroder becomes your point guard. You need a point guard. You need a wing. Tobias Harris is your wing. That's an expiring deal. For Tobias Harris, you're getting off longer term money and bigger money in DeRozan and Monk. You're getting rid of your defensive liabilities. And look, I've said this before, I don't want Monk to leave, but it's just what has to happen because of the position that Monte McNair and the previous front office put this organization in, and Vivek Ranadive too, because they wanted Zach LaVine. I always, I want to make that clear because I love Malik Monk. And so while, swapping Malik Monk for Dennis Schroder may not feel great, that may end up being the right move because where are the minutes going to be? You need to play Keon Ellis and you want to play Devin Carter as well, but you also need a point guard. And so you relieve some of the logjam at the guard position by getting rid of a defensive liability in Malik Monk, however good he is offensively. He's not a point guard. He's a scoring guard who can play make. But now you're bringing in an actual point guard and freeing up some of those minutes at the shooting guard position. So I would love if they could somehow involve DeMar, getting off DeMar's deal or some other contracts with this sign and trade, although I'm not, sure that that's going to happen. And I would also rather that the Kings get more defense in terms of size, right? You're getting a solid defensive player in Dennis Schroder. I would rather have the defensive liability be the point guard. But the problem is the Kings just have too many defensive liabilities elsewhere where this offseason, you're just not able to completely reconfigure the roster in one offseason because you have too many guys who are too highly paid, who are defensive liabilities elsewhere. Like a guy like Tyus Jones was someone who could have been a possibility for the Kings. Instead, he goes to the Magic for 1 year, $7 million. And so I would rather have a guy like that, who's a really good playmaking point guard, also cheaper, but who's not great defensively, and then improve your defense elsewhere. But again, it's just so hard to do when you're locked into these contracts. It's hard to improve your defense elsewhere. So what it kind of comes down to is you have to just wait out this season. What we have to hope that Scott Perry does is slowly but surely get his types of players onto this roster. With all that talk about the identity and the type of player that he wants on this team, hopefully he's able to actually do that and bring those types of players in. He's just not able to do it all in one offseason, most likely, unless somehow he works his magic this offseason and is able to do it. But much more likely, he's just going to bring in Dennis Schroder. He's going to send out Malik Monk. Probably going to bring in a Russell Westbrook. And he's just slowly going to implement his type of player, starting with Dennis Schroder and Westbrook at the guard position. And then hopefully like a Keon Ellis and Devin Carter, hopefully he likes those guys and those guys, and Devin Carter pans out. We already know Keon Ellis has panned out as a player, but hopefully we get him extended. And then Nick Clifford, Keegan Murray, hopefully we get that extension, right? Hopefully that's the future of this team, but we just may not be able to see that come to fruition this offseason. One thing that is interesting to note is Dennis Schroder is with the same agency that Keon Ellis and Keegan Murray are. And so that could mean absolutely nothing, but it's like, hopefully maybe that means like there's an understanding and Scott Perry has these relationships where it's like, okay, I'm going to get your guy Dennis Schroder paid here. And then we'll get a Keon Ellis extension worked out later. And we'll get a Keegan Murray extension worked out a little bit later. Hopefully that's what that means. Again, it could mean absolutely nothing, but in my speculative optimism, that's what I'm hoping that means. So then looking at some other things, I mean, just touching on Russell Westbrook real quick, bringing him in as a backup point guard, it would just be kind of hilarious. I mean, looking at the roster, if that were to happen, and you have him, you have DeRozan, you have Levine, you have Sabonis, I mean, just a hilarious roster, I can't lie. It does seem a little odd that Westbrook would want to come here, but he does want to be in California, and he's already played for both LA teams, so they probably don't want him. Or he doesn't want to go there, whichever way. Probably both. So he might want to be in California. And I mean, there might not be a whole lot of teams that want him at this point, a very old Russell Westbrook. I will say, Russell Westbrook, like, if you're gonna not be really good and not be really bad, you might as well be fun. And Russell Westbrook will be fun. He also may be extremely frustrating, but if you're able to get him, I know there will be those moments where he just goes for, a crazy dunk or a crazy defensive play where he like sells out for a steal, gambles for a steal, it works out, and he gets a dunk and he hits like 3 threes in a row and the crowd's just going crazy. Like, I can imagine that. And in terms of just the name value, that would probably be the biggest signing in Kings history. If we just don't consider the fact that he is, 37 or going to be 37 years old. If we just don't consider that, it's like the biggest name that the Kings will have ever signed. But then the other talk about free agency surrounding the Kings is the Jonathan Kuminga situation, where the Warriors obviously don't want to keep Jonathan Kuminga, and Jonathan Kuminga doesn't want to be there anymore. But the reporting has said that this is a situation that could take a bit of time. The teams that are interested, the Heat, the Bulls, the Kings, the Pelicans. So everyone's going to get off the jokes. Like, of course, these are the teams that are interested, the teams that make all the bad trades, or like the Heat are the team that are interested in everybody but don't get anybody. And then the Kings, Bulls, and Pelicans are the teams that make the stupid trades. And so Warriors fans are licking their lips like, ooh, we're gonna scam a team real bad here. But honestly, really what it feels like with the Jonathan Kuminga situation right now is nobody's really willing to pay what Jonathan Kuminga wants. And nobody's probably willing to give up what the Warriors want in a sign-and trade. So maybe Jonathan Kuminga just goes back to the Warriors for a year and then leaves in free agency or gets dealt at the deadline. But I talked about Jonathan Kuminga before. He's a high upside swing that the Kings could make, and I could be okay with that. As a restricted free agent, won't cost much. Although if you're dealing Monk in a Dennis Schroder deal, then I'm not sure who would be going the other way in a Kuminga deal. And maybe that's why we don't know what's going on with Dennis Schroder yet, because maybe they're trying to wrap this into a big deal. I don't know. I don't know what's happening. Kuminga could be an interesting player because he's so young and he's got a lot of upside. And that's something that the Kings kind of need right now. Some other interesting things, Jabari Smith Jr. signed for $122 million over 5 years. And so when you're thinking about a Keegan Murray extension, that's a number to look at. Jabari Smith Jr. was drafted 3rd. Keegan Murray was drafted 4th back in 2022. They have almost identical numbers across their seasons, pretty similar players. And that's honestly a number that's lower than I thought. But I think what we're seeing with the new CBA is that teams aren't just willing to hand out max contracts all willy-nilly. They aren't willing to take on bad contracts. You look at what happened with DeAndre Ayton. He got bought out as an expiring contract because nobody was willing to take him on as an expiring deal because his money was so bad. Julius Randle signed for $100 million for 3 years. That makes Sabonis' contract look really bad. I think at the time that Sabonis signed his contract looked fine. It's like, oh, this is what everyone's doing. Like, he's a solid 2nd, 3rd option. Give him the max deal, he'll make in the 40 millions. But with the new CBA, like, that's not what's happening. 2nd and 3rd options aren't making that much. And so it makes Sabonis' deal worse and makes it super unlikely that anyone's going to trade for it. And with Zach LaVine, that deal was already bad and it makes it way worse. So you're looking at someone like Julius Randle making $33 million. That may become the new norm, and these contracts may come down slightly from where they've been. And I think you saw that with Jabari Smith Jr. as well. And so I think the Keegan Murray extension may be a little less than what I thought it was going to be, which could be a good thing. Some other interesting point guard numbers. Trey Jones signed for $24 million for 3 years with the Chicago Bulls. D'Angelo Russell, $13 million over 2 years with the Mavericks. Ty Jerome, $28 million for 3 years with the Grizzlies. And then Tyus Jones, like I said, $7 million for 1 year with the Magic. So those were guys that the Kings could have been considering that went elsewhere, but they went elsewhere for less than what it seems like the Kings are going to give Schroder. But Schroder is better than most of them, if not all of them, I would say. I would say Dennis Schroder is the best free agent point guard in this class. And so, I mean, the Kings are going to get the best free agent point guard. So that's cool, I guess. Look, I'm excited about Dennis Schroder. I know some people are scared about what this sign and trade is going to be. I'm excited that just something's going to happen. I'm excited to see Dennis Schroder. We have to find things to get excited about because I just don't think that this season as a whole is something that we can necessarily look forward to because the Kings are going to have another season where they're stuck in the middle. But hopefully the long-term vision of Scott Perry can come to fruition. He hasn't made any moves that are going to hamstring the Kings in the future. He's just riding out the bad contracts that we have right now, making a few moves around the edges to try to get some guys on good value deals. And so while it is not exactly exciting, I am willing to have some faith in Scott Perry's long-term vision here. So anyways, that is it for this episode of the Roll Report. I will be right back here to talk about anything when things go down, when this sign and trade possibly goes down. It might go down as I'm uploading this, and that would suck. But that's just what happens in the off season, in free agency season. So when something goes down, I will see you guys then. Peace.